I think I'm very much in favor of the approach of outlawing affirmative action that's been advocated by the U.S. Supreme Court in the Students for Fair Admissions case, which, let's not forget, was brought principally because of Asian Americans who were being discriminated against. But let's remember, the flip side of really what affirmative action is a euphemism for discrimination against certain groups, Asians, whites, males, essentially. There's also discrimination against conservatives, but that's not happening through affirmative action. What I would say is you look at that decision, that's been supported by not just a majority of white Americans, but a majority of Hispanic Americans and a majority of Black Americans and of Asian Americans. And this is a consensus value. There have been a number of referenda in California to try and reintroduce affirmative action because it's been repealed by a popular initiative. And every time they try it, it's always voted down because the public does not want racial preferences in the allocation, whether it be university places at Harvard or whether it be research grants. That's against the values. I mentioned the Canadian survey. 59% want a colorblind approach versus only 29% for a color-conscious approach. And yet, what is the approach that's being pursued? A color-conscious approach in the Tri-Council. So I think it is out of step with public opinion. They may be able to get away with it for a little longer, but ultimately, I don't think that this is going to do the research body any good.
19 seconds.
Mr. Kaufman. There's some evidence about the unexpected consequences have led to misogynistic approaches. What do you think can be done to avoid this in terms of DEI?
Just a short answer, please.
Well, I think misogynistic approaches are they're contrary to the idea of judging individuals as individuals and not by their gender. So I just think a classical liberal merit-based approach where we're judging strictly on the basis of the individual is more than sufficient. Gender discrimination is against the law. It's also against the classical liberal position. I would also add that the research on...
That's our time. You can always expand on your answer in writing if you care to. So thank you. So the final 2.5 minutes goes to MP Cannings.
Well, thank you. And I just wanted to give Dr. Kerr a chance to fully answer, I think, a question that you got cut off on when you had said your first part, and then I think you started to talk about training, and I'm not sure if I'll let you finish that and see if I think that I'm trying to remember what we were talking about, but go right ahead.
Thank you, MP Cannings. Of course, academics are infamous for being long-winded, and I'm no exception. The area in which equity, diversity, and inclusion is accounted for in specific ways is in the training plan and essentially nowhere else. So it is not part of the quality of the proposal fundamentally unless there is a need to include diversity in terms of how it's evaluated. The idea here is the door open in training to everybody, or is the door open to a selection of people? An example that is extremely important to me of how this has been done successfully in the past is an Anglophone professor working in the common language of science, which is English, has implemented a number of very specific actions in the context of his research group and in terms of his department and indeed university to attempt to foster and protect the use of French language in the workplace. I'm not sure why we would want to do anything else than that, but these are opportunities for us to take the whole team and enable them to participate in the academic exercise. But that is evaluated in the application process. The goal is simply to say, does this person know how to train people who are not necessarily other white males?
And you mentioned that, when you're looking at, I assume, students to take on for research, you just look at their merit, but they've had to rise to that place. Is that, does DEI Canada Research Chairs help in that when students see people like them at that level?
I'm sure that it does. I am one of those people who comes from the majority group, so I have no shortage of role models and examples of people who look just like me who've also been very successful. But when there are examples of people who are diverse in the sense of being very different from me, I'm sure that that can create inspiration for others to believe that they too can pursue a career in that direction. And I think if that talent proves itself in the academy, wonderful. I think those people should therefore always be welcomed, but also welcomed as individuals given their personal backgrounds rather than in some sort of cookie cutter way that, there's just no litmus test here. We're looking for excellence and we're trying to foster the creation of more of it.
To end with our first panel. So thank you to our three witnesses, even the one that we unfortunately couldn't hear from verbally. However, if you have any questions, it's now my pleasure to welcome as an individual Dr. Christopher Dummett, Professor of Canadian Studies from Trent University, Dr. Daniel O'Donnell, Professor of English from the University of Lethbridge, and Bruce Pardee, Professor of Law from Queen's University by video conference. Up to 5 minutes will be given for opening remarks, after which we'll proceed with rounds of questions. Dr. Dummett, I invite you to make an opening statement of up to 5 minutes.
Thanks so much. I should say I'm a historian of Canadian politics, so this is a great honor. I'm very pleased to be here, but I'm not here to speak about the history of Canadian politics, sadly. I am here to speak about a survey I did with a data analyst from Concordia University about university professors, their political opinions, their attitudes towards academic freedom, and towards diversity. And the news I want to bring you, and this has been slightly preempted by the other witnesses, is that federal funding agencies, federal research agencies, the Canada Research Program, are at the moment ignoring the single biggest and most egregious diversity problem in higher education, and that is viewpoint diversity. This may seem like a partisan statement, and I would understand if you thought it was so, but it's just simply an accurate description of reality. The survey showed that, in our survey, Eric Hoffman found slightly different things. 76% of professors we surveyed voted for either the Liberal Party or the NDP. Only 7.6% voted for Conservatives. We asked them, maybe party identification is not the only thing you want to think about. We asked them how they would identify politically on the left or right spectrum, and 88% identified as left-leaning. So this is, of course, pretty significantly different than the rest of the population and of a category of a magnitude which is really unlike any other kind of diversity concerns that higher education is currently concerned about. Now, it might be tempting to dismiss this as a concern only for conservatives. Again, I would understand if some would think that would be the case. And certainly there are consequences for conservatives. They reported in our survey high rates of self-censorship, finding the workplace to be a hostile workplace, and a whole host of problems. I should say we also found that centrist, sometimes even left-leaning scholars, particularly feminist scholars who thought about the importance of biological sex as a really important category, also reported really great concerns about political discrimination. So it's not just a right-left concern, but it is, I want to suggest to you, not a partisan concern. It's a concern that matters towards the purpose of higher education as a truth-seeking and trying to truth-validating research enterprise. I think that the lack of viewpoint diversity significantly damages the purpose of higher education, which I greatly support. How does it do this in practice? Well, first of all, it just reduces the effectiveness of peer review. John Stuart Mill said, "He who knows only his own side of the case knows very little." Peer review is supposed to give you the best criticisms by the most knowledgeable people who are going to be most critical of your work. You don't have to change your mind just because you face that criticism, but you will know your side and be much more robust by knowing that. The fact is that a university higher education sector which is so devoid of divergent opinions prevents this from happening. There are other concerns. Self-censorship as well makes this even worse. So the small numbers of conservatives and academics who are there reported to us that almost half of them were too frightened to have their colleagues even know their politics. Right? So the ability of them to actually effectively do peer review, especially in the social sciences and humanities, is greatly diminished. This leads to what some social psychologists call reputational cascades. And this is a process whereby information that is untrue or at least partial or inaccurate can be accepted in certain groups as accurate if those who have alternate viewpoints don't speak up and aren't able to speak up. Right? So this is a major concern. It also brings us a problem. That is, as they say, an institution that lacks viewpoint diversity in the way that higher education does also leads to the possibility of group polarization. Group polarization is the really well-known phenomena whereby in groups, small or large, where many people actually already think alike, the absence of divergent opinions makes everyone's individual opinion, which may be more moderate, after processes of discussion, assessment, even more radical at the end because they're not faced opinions and corrective discussions. So it's a serious concern. Ironically, the current EDI policies in the Tri-Council agencies and in the Canada Research Program might actually be making it worse. The extent to which diversity statements are required, these act as a kind of political statements. I did hear Professor Kerr talking about the importance of diversity and having different perspectives in the research, and I fundamentally agree with what he was saying. But diversity statements ask for certain kinds of understanding diversity and certain politicized ways of understanding diversity. It's not about eliminating discrimination. It's about having a very politically partisan idea of what EDI means. And if you don't have those particular kinds of terms in your assessment, then it's very possible that you'll be rated lower and weeded out. So it's either you either have to lie on your assessment or risk not getting funding. What's more, the other problem is that often programs that are meant to attract equity-deserving groups or underrepresented groups come paired not just with a desire to improve those groups, but they come paired, and I'm not sure how much this reaches this level, paired with certain kinds of other qualifications. So things like a position or funding might be advertised for someone who has a commitment to, say, decolonization or anti-racist pedagogy. I've seen these in ads for a whole bunch of things.
That's over our time, but you can elaborate in the question period. So we will now turn to Professor Pardee. Invite you to make an opening statement of up to 5 minutes, please.
Thank you. Madam Chair, the members of your committee may be familiar with the Big Bang Theory. Not the explosion, the TV sitcom. It's about 4 scientist nerds who work at a research university. In one episode, they argue with the university president, who says to them, "Let me ask you something. What do you think the business of this university is?" "Science," one of the science nerds replies. "Money," the president snorts. In Canada, the business of universities isn't just money. It's government money. The business of Canadian universities, in large part, is to get their hands on as much government money as they can. They have become chronic welfare recipients like the CBC, dependent on government largesse with no prospect of becoming self-sustaining. These are deep, black holes into which gobs of money disappear. If you are a young professor today, your university probably doesn't care so much about your work. It cares more about whether you get federal grants. From every grant, universities skim a cool chunk off the top, like 40%. To get the grant, you must pitch research that the granting councils like. And universities have whole departments of administrators dedicated to getting their academics to pitch the research in a way that will please the people holding the purse strings. Federal research money corrupts the intellectual enterprise of universities. My academic colleagues and I are among the many, many Canadians feeding at the public trough. The public sector is 40% of this country's economy. That's not sustainable. It's one of the many reasons this country is becoming poor. He who pays the piper calls the tune. Government money always comes with strings, ideological strings, political strings. The way to have politically neutral research is not to have government granting agencies. You are studying whether to reform federal research funding. Don't reform it. Abolish it. Get rid of it. Universities fall under provincial jurisdiction. Please stop interfering. Please stop taking money from truck drivers and cashiers and giving it to elite institutions. Please stop corrupting the intellectual enterprise. Please stop requiring and funding discrimination against white people, Asian people, and men. Please stop dictating how research is done and by whom. Please get federal money out of the business of Canadian universities. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that opening statement. And now we will turn to Dr. O'Donnell. The floor is yours for your opening statement of 5 minutes.
Bonjour, mesdames et messieurs.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Dan O'Donnell. I'm a professor of medieval English and humanities that is at the University of Lethbridge. And I'm very happy to be here to speak to you today and to present the evidence, the testimony that I have to give to you.
First time at this committee. Just over a decade ago, Italian researcher Domenico Fermante published an article in the journal Historical Social Research focusing on what he called an Anglo-American hegemony that he believed controlled access to the most prominent journals, conferences, and standards in the then fast-growing discipline of the digital humanities. The digital humanities was, and remains today, a key driver in applying computation to cultural, social, and political problems. It's the field that first modeled Michelangelo's David in 3D, contributed to some of the most important mechanisms for processing text with computers, and helped develop the standard character encodings that allow us to use computers in languages other than English. Today, researchers in the digital humanities are at the cutting edge of cultural applications in artificial intelligence, in big data, and in the critical examination of how infrastructure shapes the questions we ask about ourselves. If it's the job of scientists to solve problems, and if it's the job of humanists to problematize solutions, then digital humanists end up doing both. They develop cutting-edge tools, and they also offer technologically literate critiques of those same solutions when they fall short or require improvement. And this brings me to the motion before your committee. Fermante's claim that there was an Anglo-American hegemony in the leadership of the global digital humanities was in fact incorrect. To the extent that there was a small group of scholars leading the field's most important organs and projects, those people were neither British nor American. They were Canadian. In fact, there were as many Francophone Canadians on Fermante's list as there were British people. Just as importantly, these Canadians were not based at the usual suspects, our big U15s, such as the University of Toronto, McGill, UBC, or the University of Alberta. Instead, they came from smaller U15s or the Francophone U15s, like McMaster and the Université de Montréal, and especially from smaller comprehensive research universities such as Victoria, Guelph, and my own university, the University of Lethbridge. I flag this because, as the Bouchard report suggests, Canadian researchers, especially from smaller comprehensive research universities, have lost a lot of ground since Fermante wrote his article. At that time, Canada was second only to the U.S. in its number of digital humanities centers. Today, we're nowhere close to third or fourth place. Our researchers, too, have moved. The U15 now dominate Canadian digital humanities, largely because they have the resources to attract talent from the smaller ones. Of the 8 Canadians on Fairmonte's list in 2012, 6 have been recruited by U15 institutions, and only 2 remain at smaller universities as Canada Research Chairs. I, too, was on the list and was recruited, having been offered a job at the University of Saskatchewan, although I had to turn it down for personal reasons. I stayed at the U of L because it once supported my SSHRC-funded research on scanning early medieval crosses in 3D and my work as the chair of the Text Encoding Initiative, a major international computing standard. Even as we speak today, I am in discussions, however, about moving a major SSHRC-funded textual project and associated graduate students to a U15 because we no longer have the resources at the U of L to create a position for the adjunct who brought us the project in the first place. In preparing my remarks, I reviewed testimony from my colleagues, Vincent Lariviere at the University of Montreal and Dina McMartin, my own vice president of research, and both emphasized the importance of understanding excellence in the broadest sense as a question of capacity rather than competition. In Excellence R Us, University Research and the Fetishization of Excellence, an article I co-wrote with a number of colleagues from the UK, Australia, and Canada, we argued that national research capacity is far more important to research success than a narrow focus on identifying winners and losers. And this is particularly true when it comes to developing the kind of knowledge reservoir the Bouchard report describes as having been critical in the global response to COVID, and I would argue underpins our societal developing consensus and developing understanding of things like marriage equality 20 years ago, gender equity, and systemic bias. Much of the reservoir is filled at global universities, like my daughter's alma mater of Harvard or mine of Toronto and Yale. But universities like Lethbridge, Guelph, Victoria also play a critical role. Our system has been one that's great historically at fostering research across the country rather than concentrating it in a few elite locations, which is perhaps a uniquely Canadian form of research excellence. But as DH over the last 10 years demonstrates, we are now beginning to lose that advantage.
Sorry, that's the end of your time, but hopefully you'll get to elaborate
Main
through our
point
questions. Thank you all for your opening remarks. We'll now open the floor to questions. Please be sure to indicate to whom your questions are directed. And we'll ask MP Pearson to start off for the first 6 minutes, please.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair, and I want to thank the witnesses for being here and online. I just wanted to start with Mr. Dummett. You published this report, Viewpoint Diversity Crisis at Canadian Universities, a little while ago, 2022. Just wondering, what was your experience in producing that report? And it's an interesting report. I'm just wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on what, just not even necessarily the results of the report, but just your experience of producing it.
Sure. Well, ironically, the report was doing the research, just simply asking professors what their political viewpoints were, what their attitudes towards diversity were, and being it was difficult in and of itself. In fact, we faced a kind of online campaign from other scholars, other federally funded scholars, to shut down the research. They contacted our universities, our ethics board. We had to pull back the funding, go through a whole other process, go through ethics. I kind of did double check it because our universities were so frightened of the blowback from simply asking pretty simple questions about essentially who people voted for, what their politics were, what they thought about EDI in a general way. So it was a kind of example of why research by scholars who are political minority scholars is just really hard to do.
You kind of talked, I think, I'm not sure quite the term that you used, but you talked about like a waterfall effect or like an exponential
Cascade.
growth. Yeah. Well, how, do you see any way of kind of self-correcting that without perhaps using the exact tools that we're somewhat concerned about here?
I think that what I was trying to get at when I was talking about reputational cascades is obviously you had a witness before, esteemed witness talking about the natural sciences. And I think the research in the social science and humanities is just fundamentally different here. So let's say you're trying to research something like the effectiveness of harm reduction. And we know that people on the political spectrum psychologically just have different makeups. And so when you're going to assess, what are the costs of harm reduction? Why would it work? Why wouldn't it work? you want in the room, you want people doing research on that topic to come from the full diversity of perspectives and to really fundamentally assess that. And the danger when you don't have that is you get certain stories that are told, certain bullet points that are accepted within academic disciplines as true, as operating assumptions that just haven't been tested. And it's because of this kind of cascade of untested information.
You mentioned political loyalty tests and how they kind of either self-select or self-censor, folks that are self-censoring. Could you elaborate on that a little bit more and perhaps point out how if it's from your side, you might be blind to the fact that that's even a political task? Yeah,
thanks. I didn't get a chance to really say that effectively. Things like diversity statements in expecting a certain kind of language are a kind of classic example of systemic discrimination. They pretend to be neutral. They ostensibly are neutral. They just want diversity, but they have expectations that an applicant is going to describe it in a way that fits a certain political standard approach to that. And there are a diversity of ways of thinking about how you create a society in which discrimination is not there. But when you have expectations to include these things, or as I was saying, when you expect candidates to have a commitment to say something like decolonization, no one working in the field of decolonization is a conservative. So ostensibly it's a neutral claim, but it's really a political litmus test. It's a systemic discrimination that's built in to the way this thing works.
Interesting. Mr. Party, would you be interested in commenting on any of this as well?
Oh, I agree completely with Chris that the political strings are as he describes, inevitably so. Now you can change the nature of the strings, and that would be an improvement, I suppose, to encourage viewpoint diversity, for sure. We have the problem that he is identifying, no question about it. But if you keep it and just reform it, then you're going to get just different kinds of strings. For my money, the problem is having the overseers with the power to direct the activities of both individual researchers and the universities themselves. These programs require conformity of a type, not just from the applicants, but from the institutions. They have requirements for EDI action plans on behalf of the institutions. And in order to qualify for Canada Research Chairs, for example, you have institutions complying with Tri-Council documents. And that means that the whole institution is driven by the political, ideological agenda that is embedded in the Tri-Council programs.
Can you talk about any countries that you know of around the world that are doing like a kind of an example for us that we could have a look at and say, hey, these folks are doing it well?
Well, an example of what? So all you need to do is find if you're asking me what my preference is, for a country that doesn't do this, like just doesn't, governments call their handouts investments. I mean, the government's claiming to make investments in the CBC. It's not an investment. It's a handout. If you call it an actual investment, is something that you get an actual return on, a concrete return. You invested this much and you got this much return for it. That's not the way the government calculates its investments.
We're going to the next questioner now. And our next questioner would be MP Chen for 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I'll start with my first question to Professor Party. You spoke about universities skimming off the top 40% of the money that is given through federal grants to students.
Not to students.
Not to students.
No.
And okay. I'm not. So help me understand. Maybe you could explain a bit further what you meant by that.
Right. So when a researcher gets a Tri-Council grant for doing some kind of research, there are policies in place so that the money comes off that grant to cover overhead costs. Like, that's the rationale. There's overhead costs. You're doing the research at this institution. Therefore, we need a cut in order to cover the costs of the overhead. Well,
so are these researchers doctoral students, or you're talking about researchers that are not
necessarily? Sometimes they're faculty. Often they're faculty, right?
Okay.
So this is a way.
But it does include students, right?
If the students are included in the research grant,
right.
Sure.
So, so we heard from folks from SSHRC and NSERC at our last committee meeting. So I'm just trying to understand how it works. So, in terms of, for example, a SSHRC doctoral fellowship that goes to a student, or an NSERC postgrad scholarship, these are monies that flow through from the granting agencies. So 40% of that, you're saying, would go off the top and go towards university overhead?
To be clear, I'm not saying it's always 40%. I'm not saying it's the same at every institution. I'm not saying it's the same for fellowships as opposed to, faculty research grants. My point is this: these research grants are a way to funnel money to the institutions as well as to the individual researchers. In other words, don't believe that this is just a government to individual researcher relationship. The universities have an interest in their faculty getting research grants because it affects the university's bottom lines. They are very anxious to get their hands on this money in some way. And that's why they're so interested in their own faculty getting the grants. As I alluded to, in some places, it looks like, it gives the appearance of the universities being more interested in whether or not their faculty get grants than in the work they actually do. It's all about the money.
Got it. So you're a professor. You're a professor of law at Queen's. You mentioned in your testimony that you don't want to see the continuation of research being dictated to scholars in terms of what research and by whom. So could you share in your experience how has the government or the tri-agency agencies been dictating the type of research that you've encountered in your work as a professor?
At some of these universities, it is a common thing to have, like, for example, seminars or meetings for academics to come and hear from people who know about how to angle and frame and write your research proposal so that it will receive favorable response from the people at the granting agencies, the councils, and the peer reviewers, and so on, so that you succeed in your attempt to get hold of research funding. In other words, it is not enough. In an ideal world, you would get a researcher who says, okay, well, I want to investigate X. You write down what you want to investigate and you hand it in. Okay? That's not the way it works. The way it works is, how am I going to get the grant? Who is there? What's their criteria? What's their background? Who's going to be evaluating me? Who can I get for a peer reviewer? And then I'm going to craft it so that the thing works successfully. That is all caused by the carrot of the money. You are
speaking of peer review. Let me just turn over to Professor Dummett. You also mentioned the effectiveness of peer review or lack of it. My question to you is, given the shortfalls that you've identified in the peer review process, what would you suggest as the alternative?
Well, I think the alternative is just for federal funding agencies and other institutions to really begin to think about viewpoint diversity, to put it on your radar when you're thinking about diversity. I'm a big believer in peer review. I think peer review at its best should give us robust, better, more accurate information and scholarship. But I just think that we've got a significant problem in higher education of a lack of viewpoint diversity, and it's that lack of diversity which just hampers, it really diminishes the ability of peer review to work.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned half of academics being fearful of having their politics known. One of the concepts in qualitative research is reflexivity, which in proposing a research study, a researcher would situate themselves in terms of their experiences, any assumptions or beliefs, because I think I think everyone would agree that research is not biased. Is biased, and so there's an importance to reflect on one's positioning. And so my question is, if that is the case, do you believe that even in that respected way of conducting research and positioning oneself as a researcher, that people still are afraid of situating their political views?
Just a quick answer because it's a little over time.
Quick answer is that those processes of self-reflection don't really work effectively when done by individuals. They work best when done by institutions and groups where other people are best able to call you out on what are your biases.
Thank you. Okay, we'll now turn to MP Blanchard-Joca for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for being here. I have a question for Mr. Dummett. Mr. Dummett, in a brief that you prepared with 38 of your colleagues that was research on post-secondary institutions, you expressed a concern about small universities being penalized. Can you explain to us how these criteria affect researchers, and what would you recommend to ensure academic excellence in smaller universities?
Yeah, I think in that brief we presented what we were concerned about is the way in which when you put a lot of the regulatory burden on universities to meet these criteria is quite significant. And it's one thing if you're University of Toronto, my colleague here was just speaking about Lethbridge. I come teach at Trent University. It's a great institution, but it just doesn't have the administrative ability to do that. I would say in another sense, it also makes the questions about meeting DEI criteria really difficult when your university is very small. And this literally just came up at a research policy meeting last week. Meeting these criteria, having one position has just a huge impact on the overall percentage of these things. And so the lack of flexibility around these things, the criteria just pose a huge burden at a place like Trent and a place like Lethbridge, I'm assuming, that they just wouldn't at the University of Toronto.
Merci.
Some institutions like MIT will no longer ask for diversity declarations from applicants to become professors. Do you think this is a good movement within universities? Will that improve the quality of research and teaching?
And I think there's the big distinction to be made between including diversity in research design, making sure your research design is accurate and effective, like the previous witness, Professor Kerr, was saying. Fundamentally important to think about how that affects research design. But it's an entirely different matter in the way diversity statements are included and expect a certain kind of language which act as political loyalty tests. So, for example, if one were to talk about the importance of like as Professor Kaufman did, of a kind of merit-based, blind assessment, that would be a signal to people assessing that research that wouldn't even have to come up in a meeting, but could significantly affect their scoring on your application. Nothing will be said about someone's partisan political beliefs, but everyone would know where someone was coming from, and it could significantly, reduce their chances of getting funding.
Merci. Selon Erin Anderson, les scientifiques.
According to Erin Anderson, academics and politicians don't have the same ideas. And if they can't express difference, there is a difficulty. When you have researchers that work together, but if there is no discussion of difference, that can reduce productivity. How can you create then a uniform environment where you can have that type of discussion, but not have to bow to DEI diktats? Is there something that can be done in universities?
Am I optimistic something can be done? No. Is there something can be done? I think you can factor this into a whole host of things in this institution. It's going to think about higher education funding and make those research funding decisions really based on the research. Ensure that when if there's a political officer in the room assessing the politics of these things, that they're thinking more than about party politics, that they're thinking about the small p political elements that will enter into research funding decisions, especially in the humanities and social sciences. It's not about saying someone doesn't say, I don't like that person because they're a liberal or they're conservative. That's not the issue. It's about the underguiding cultural assumptions that operate in certain groups. And when an institution is, as we found, almost 90% made up of people from a certain political perspectives, it is impossible that that organization is not going to be troubled by these concerns and by these biases.
Merci.
Thank you. Mr. Dummett, some researchers say that the introduction of DEI has reduced and limited academic freedom by establishing constraints in the selection of types of research and researchers. Do you agree or not?
In particular, I think there should be a lot of research about DEI. I know just this week there was a research report out of a U.S. institute that talked about the incredibly kind of counterintuitive negative implications of certain kinds of DEI training, and the report was that this didn't get reported in the New York Times because it fell offside. I think that kind of thing is happening for researchers all the time in Canada, that they would be reluctant to take on this research. I'm a full professor. It's a lovely job, and it's tenure, and it's a great thing. But if I was recommending to a young graduate student, someone who wanted to come into the field, I would absolutely not recommend that they take a position that was critical of EDI. They would be guaranteeing that they wouldn't get research funding and they wouldn't get a job.
Est-ce que il y a des
Is there any proof or scientific data that universities have been able to reduce bias or change behavior?
Slightly going beyond my expertise, so I'll just say that right off the outset. But I am a member of a U.S.-based organization called Heterodox Academy, which is really committed to universities as truth-seeking institutions, nonpartisan, and they've done a lot of research out of that institution, which talks about the ineffectiveness of DEI, a host of different kinds of DEI training on actually reducing discrimination. There is some evidence, as I understand it, that in some kinds of training can actually make things worse and can lead to worse climates. I won't pretend to be an expert on that, but I know of research.
In any case, so thank you. So now we turn to MP Cannings for 6 minutes.
Well, thank you to the witnesses for being here. I'm going to turn to Dr. O'Donnell. You gave the example of digital humanists and the funding they've been getting, how it's shifted over the years. You're from a smaller institution at University of Lethbridge, but you're saying more of it is going to U15 universities now. Do you have is there any logical explanation for that other than some bias towards big research universities? Is, the usual thing we hear in this committee is that U15 universities have bigger, better infrastructure. And I'm just wondering if maybe the digital world of digital humanists the digital part has gotten more complex and more expensive. What's your explanation for that?
Well, it's actually very tied, I think, to the discussion of viewpoint diversity that we're having here. The idea that 15 years ago, digital humanities was being essentially run out of smaller universities, that was not just a Canadian thing. If you look at the universities in the States, for example, the most dominant universities in digital humanities were places like Nebraska, not Yale. And one of the reasons for that is the ability to experiment, the freedom to experiment that you had in smaller universities at the time. I think the reason why things have changed is it's not that we're losing at tri-agency. I'm in the humanities. I'm an English professor. I have over $1 million in grants in my career, which for a humanist is not a bad number. But like I said, I have an untenured adjunct professor who became the lead on a 40-year-old project now in digital humanities. But exactly the point that my colleague was making, she brought it to us as an adjunct. hiring her in our department in order to keep the 5 graduate students she's brought and this $300,000 grant would increase my faculty complement in the department that I chair by about 12%. And that's a huge ask compared to the University of Alberta or the University of Toronto. And so the issue I think that's really coming is the bigger universities in digital humanities were behind the curve in the beginning because these are big departments that are fairly, in many fields, fairly consensus-based. And it was the smaller departments where you had a bit more intellectual freedom to pursue things quickly and early that developed the field. But it's much easier for a big university to play catch-up. And it's absolutely the case that a big university is never going to lose an Insight grant because they can't create a position for somebody. And so I think that's where it's coming. It's not even the size of the equipment that you have. It's the scale. And ironically, smaller universities, the description of how block grants are or how grant overhead is paid earlier is not anything that I am aware of. Normally what happens in Canada is you get a block grant that's given to your university based on your success in funding. And I think it's about $7 million is the tipping point. Below that, you get less money and you also don't get a percentage the same way you do at a big university, when it really should be the other way around, because the costs of maintaining a grant at a small university in relation to the overall size of the pot is massively different.
How much did
Almost 2 minutes left.
Almost 2 minutes. Okay, good. I will turn then to Mr. Party. You basically talked of defunding universities, university research. The business of universities, you said, is getting government money. They're chronic welfare recipients. This corrupts the university enterprise. You have to, whoever pays the piper or calls the tune, all the strings attached. I guess I'm left wondering where universities should go for this funding then, and how will that stop the corruption?
Well, I think we should start with the division of powers in the Canadian Constitution. Education, including higher education, is a provincial matter of jurisdiction. I don't understand why the federal government is involved in this.
So you think that, sorry to interrupt, but do you think that provincial governments would have less strings? And, you know, I can see there may be different strings if I was applying for funding in Alberta versus British Columbia. For instance, I'm from British Columbia. And, you know, they might be different strings, but I can't see how that process of, you know, what you label corruption, and I almost get the impression you're saying it's corruption because you don't agree with the present government here. I'm not necessarily a fan of theirs either, but I don't, you know.
No, okay, just to be clear though, when I say corruption, I don't like, okay, let's be very clear. When I say corruption, I don't mean brown envelopes of cash under the door.
And I know you don't. I know you don't.
I'm talking about the corruption of the intellectual enterprise, as in the influence that the promise of funding has on the questions that are pursued and how they are pursued. So
in other things, you're saying universities should be funded strictly by the provinces?
Well, sure. Yes, I do. And in the same way that I think that healthcare should be funded by the provinces, because healthcare is a provincial responsibility.
Well, so and I just don't. I don't know. I just don't see the intellectual behind all these other things that you complain about the federal government. I don't see that changing under provincial government. That's all. I'm just.
Well, why don't you? But I think the solution there is to allow the provinces to work it out for themselves. Now, I might have the same criticism of a provincial government's approach if they chose something similar. But the point is, it's a provincial responsibility. Why don't you let them work it out? And if they were to put together a program that resembled what we're talking about, then I would have criticisms for them as well. But they're at least within their jurisdiction now.
How much?
A minute.
A minute. Oh my goodness, time flies. Actually, it doesn't fly when you're having fun. But so I'll continue on this then. Yeah, sure. And you commented on how, there's 40% taken off the top. That doesn't come off.
Yeah, I want to be very clear. So
if I can just, sorry, that was just the start of my question.
Fine, yeah.
And it seemed like, the universities were, eagerly trying to claw money wherever they could find it. The fact is the government funding of universities has steadily declined over the last 30, 40 years. And so universities are desperate for cash. They're looking for cash wherever they can find it. They've upped tuition fees. They brought in lots of foreign students so they can get higher tuition fees. They're taking bigger and bigger chunks off of research grants from the researchers, not from the students.
Yeah. Right.
So again, to fix that, the only way I can see that being fixed is if the provincial governments, in your view, should be funding universities at a much, much higher rate than they are now. And
there are lots of possibilities, and I'm not concluding this, but you're assuming that all the universities that exist and should expand because they've expanded during a period, and now they find, maybe they're too big now because the international students are not there. So, but on the 40%,
I'm sorry, that is the time. So we're going to turn now to the 5-minute round, and we're going to start that off with MP Kitchen.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you all for being here, and your presentation is greatly appreciated as we start this new study and look at it. How do we improve excellence? And as you might have heard in the previous study we did, where we were looking at the capstone and aspects of how do we take federal funding and delegate that. And what I'm hearing around the table in various ways is concerns about political decision makings, political biases that might have been made in as we move forward, instead of looking at what's the individual's scholar's individual merit and basically what the quality of the proposed research is. Now we talk about issues like EDI or DEI, depending on how we look at it. But these are aspects, and I guess to you, Dr. Dummett, to start off with, what do we do to stop that? What suggestions would you have to say, how do we resolve that such that professors, whether they're in big university U15 or whether they're in smaller universities or that are applying for these, how do we stop that?
Sorry, can I just clarify? Stop the political discrimination?
Correct.
Yeah. I mean, the simple answer is you need a more diverse higher education sector. I think that's tricky to do. I think there are some reasons that might be traditional, that certain kinds of people might be attracted to university, and they might be more on the left generally. Although I think the ratio is so skewed that it's hard to think that other factors aren't involved. So I would think that at a host of levels, whether it's things that you can't do, but say hiring, job advertisements, but in things that you can control on research funding, that we think about the way in which certain fields, certain disciplines contain political assumptions within them, and that we try to open those out to more diverse perspectives. So if you're having a field and a funding agency in something like settler colonial studies, that comes just with a whole host of political assessments. I mean, I'm fascinated by the history of settler colonial nations, but my perspectives are not welcome in settler colonial studies. So if you're advertising a position in that area, it's not really open to diverse perspectives. So whether you're advertising jobs in these fields, whether you're advertising research funds, you have to include that kind of small p political assessment to make sure that you have kind of institutional neutrality. Actually,
thank you. And I'm sorry for interrupting. I appreciate that. I mean, one of the suggestions we've had around over time and reports we've had presented is basically from a tri-council EDI aspect of policies, they should just be abolished. Your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that's unlikely to happen, but I think if they're going to exist, then they should include viewpoints there as well. They shouldn't just be about other categories. If I would reform them, I would have them be based not on the general population levels, but on the funnel of applicants. So as I understand it, at my university, when we're thinking about our percentage of Canada research chairs, we have to match the percentage of a certain identity group in the general population, regardless of whether the pipeline to provide us those applicants is open and diverse. And it just doesn't make sense. That's just bad statistics. You want to look at, how many people are there. And if they're not there at the PhD level, the problem isn't at our hiring level. It's there at, why aren't they attracted to this level? Are there barriers further down the line? And so I would reform it by thinking about assessing, not assuming that discrimination is the problem, but open and say, where is the problem? Is it discrimination? It might be. But it might be a whole host of factors that are just assumed under the current system.
Thank you. And Dr. O'Donnell, and I can tell you I had an opportunity to tour Lethbridge this past summer. I was golfing at the golf course right beside it, but I did get a tour of Lethbridge. I appreciate that. It's a great university. And we're talking about smaller universities here. And throughout, when we're talking about researchers, those researchers that are making those applications, they obviously are put in a design of what they're doing. They may be looking at postgraduate students working with them. They may be postdoctoral students working, and they're funding that. So that's part of their agenda they put forward. What about from the institution's point of view? Obviously, if they're doing a research, they're using facilities at that institution. What are the costs to them to pay for using the labs, et cetera? Is that a contract that's worked out individually?
No, it's not in Canada. So worldwide, there's basically no research funding, whether it comes from a private institution or a government institution, that doesn't pay overhead. And the reason is because the funders are paying for certain research, but the researchers are not building the labs themselves or paying for the heat. And so the university needs that. 40% is actually a bit low in some cases in medical. For instance, I have colleagues at the UCLA, 60% is what they can be charged on medical grants. So the universities do need that money because, they're supplying me with a lab. They're supplying graduate students with services. And that money in Canada, though, is from tri-agency paid via a block grant based on there's various tipping points, but I believe it's $7 million in funding in any 1 year. If you're above that, you then fall into essentially the category Toronto and everybody belongs to. But that's quite a hard number to get for even a university like U of L with 600 faculty members. And so we're below that, which means we get a kind of base amount plus some share of a percentage of the funding that we receive. To go to overhead, that pays for the research administration staff, it pays for financial staff and everything.
But I wanted you to fully explain it. That was important. Okay, so now we're going to turn to MP Jazik for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses, both panels. Fascinating discussion. But I'd just like to go back to the purpose of our study, and that is to look at the criteria that are used in terms of the evaluation of research proposals and whether we would recommend any modifications. And Madam Chair, I would say that it would have been very helpful if we could have started off our study with a really clear idea of what those criteria currently are. And so, Dr. O'Donnell, you have a considerable experience. You've obviously been very successful in your career in achieving research funding. So could you help us and describe what the criteria specifically are that are looked for in an application?
My experience on funding panels, I've also done a fair bit of adjudication work. I think at SSHRC, I've done everything except for insight. The criteria vary from grant to grant. Partnership grants, for example, which are about developing networks of researchers, will have an emphasis on buy-in from partners, on evidence of contributions. Conference grants will have evidence that there's other money coming in. So it really does vary from grant to grant. But on the whole, I think it's fair to say that you are adjudicated on capability, which is the evidence that you can provide that you are able to deliver the kind of research that you're planning to do. You're judged on the intrinsic domain-specific merit of the research that you're proposing to do, and you're judged on the sort of overall research design and aspects like that. And then when you're on a panel at SSHRC, which is again most of my experience, I've also done the frontiers. These are presented to you on the criteria are on a piece of paper like a restaurant menu in front of you as you talk, and then the committee goes around essentially using this as a rubric. And you have multiple readers. They discuss at the end, and then at the very end, once again, they put up a thing on the screen where they divide the categories in these infamous boxes at SSHRC, where they ask essentially, under capability, training of students is one that shows up, excellent, good, satisfactory, poor, and the committee has to come to a consensus about that.
So is there any category in that box that says that there's a need for some sort of acknowledgement of diversity, equity, inclusiveness? Is that a category?
It shows up in the New Frontiers in Science program, is the place where I've seen it, which is a tri-agency. It's not one of the specific agencies. It's a group that goes beyond that. It's interdisciplinary. And as part of that, you're asked to indicate how you are supporting, in essence, diversity viewpoint in terms of creating space for people who have perhaps non-traditional experiences to participate. The place where it really shows up, however, I would say is in the ensuring that you are not inadvertently shutting diversity down. And so a very, very common question that shows up is, how are you going to create the space so that people who maybe feel like they are being not heard can report that?
Thank you. So, Dr. Dammit, do you find that reassuring to a certain extent? Because you seem to be very conscious that some people are being excluded.
Well, as far as I understand it, when the assessors think about who is excluded or included in the research, they don't include viewpoint diversity in that. They're not thinking about political diversity. So no, I'm not reassured at all. And I think the assessments about whether a research design is good, whether it's interesting, whether it's solid, contain a whole host of implicit assumptions. And when 90% of and maybe higher in certain fields, of the people on that panel are making assessments about merit, about interest, about how innovative the research design is, and if they share political opinions and aren't asked to think about the way in which their assessments are based on their own political assessments and don't have people in the room who call them on that, I'm not reassured at all.
So perhaps would you see that the adjudication panel might be expanded, that they could bring that viewpoint to the panel?
Yeah, I think two things. I think, in fairness, I think the question is to have more diverse viewpoints on the panel. But then, if that assessments are going to be part of it, that I think political viewpoint diversity should really be a part of the assessment. Yeah.
Is that?
Sorry. Okay, we'll now turn to MP Blanchet-Jocard for 2.5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to continue with Mr. Dimmitt. In the brief that you shared with your colleagues, you recommended abolishing DEI in the granting agencies at the level of your fellow professors. You said that there could also be consequences about social cohesion in the universities and institutions concerning the application of DEI. Can you just expand on that?
Yeah, I think that if it doesn't contain viewpoint diversity, I think DEI is a serious problem. I think it represents problems of social cohesion at the university for those people who want to represent divergent voices. They want to have different opinions. And for someone who wants to do research on, let's say, for example, the possible negative impacts or of DEI, or asking, does it work? And asking that from a perspective which is just genuinely open-minded and doesn't contain certain assumptions, life is difficult for those people. And I think it makes it very difficult at the university for those kinds of projects to get funded and people to do research.
Merci. Toujours sur l'en
Thank you. In your brief, you also mentioned that the criteria of DEI do not have any ultimate final goal or objective. They lack clarity. So would you also say then that a long-term, clearly stated goal would be necessary?
Yeah, I think that's definitely the case. And I think that if we're going to have DEI criteria, we ought to be really flexible with what they are and who's equity deserving at any one point in time, and we're not operating on past assumptions. I teach at Trent University, which is sort of, some people call it in the north. I don't think it's north, but a lot of the most disadvantaged students in my classrooms are often, what white rural kids from backgrounds people who don't have university education, and those are people who wouldn't be considered equity deserving by a whole host of categories, but they don't fit in at the university, and I think that they. We need to be very flexible what we mean about who deserves special attention and who deserves assistance in higher education.
Merci. D'autres choses incontournables que vous aimeriez rajouter?
Anything else that you feel is important to add about your work on DEI?
I guess I think it's a pretty, maybe about viewpoint diversity in general. I would say I just would call people from different perspectives to think this really matters. I think Eric Kaufman mentioned about public trust in higher education. I'm not an anti-university kind of person. I love my job. I love the world in which I live. But I would warn people that the lack of viewpoint diversity does threaten public trust. And I would hate to see Canada go down the route that the U.S. has followed.
We're soon going to be out of resources. So for the last 2.5 minutes, it's yours, Mr. Canning.
Well, thank you. And I'm going to continue on with Dr. Dummett about this idea of viewpoint diversity, because I'm a biologist, I'm an ecologist, and we talk about, Dr. Kerr was talking about evolution and selection and all that. And I'm wondering about, I've just been thinking as you've been talking about the idea of self-selection. We all, when we're young and looking towards what we want to be in life, we make these choices about what interests us, And I guess one little anecdote about viewpoint diversity. In my previous life, I sat on a couple of very high-level boards where they needed a biologist, and everybody else was a billionaire or a CEO of a very large company. And that was an environment where I kept my politics to my chest because I was clearly not in the majority. And there was some very inflammatory language around that table about the NDP, for instance. And I wasn't a member of the NDP at the time, but I supported them and I kept that silent. But in my university world, when I was at UBC, the students that came, took my courses, chose to study ecology, the environment, whatever. And I can see that if you were going into social work as well. Would you go into social work and even if you had certain views to start, once you worked in that field with underprivileged people, lower income people, saw their struggles, I just think that you would be selecting for people who would have those political views. And I'm just wondering if you could comment on that.
So I'll try to be quick. I welcome your question. What I like about your question is that you're asking, is there something aside from discrimination involved here?
Totally.
And what I wish is that other policies on EDI ask the same question, because I think it's a fair assessment. I think to a certain extent there is a self-selection going on here. Whether it represents the full problem, I don't know.
I think it's huge.
But I think those same kinds of assessments for people from maybe think slightly different than me aren't being asked in about other questions of diversity in higher education, and they need to be asked by people who are also critical of the kinds of assumptions that are operating.
The button. Thank you so much. Thank you to the witnesses, Dr. Christopher Dummett, Dr. Daniel O'Donnell, and Professor Bruce Pardy for your testimonies and participations in the committee study. Is it the will of the committee to adjourn the meeting? Meeting adjourned.